Caribbean National Commissions, for UNESCO, officials of Ministry of Education in the Caribbean, regional development partners, distinguished colleagues, participants, good day. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the fourth and final engagement in the UNESCO Caribbean Futures of Education webinar series. Over the last 8 weeks, educational leaders, policymakers, planners, and educators have been engaged in a series of thought-provoking and aspirational dialogues to rethink and reframe the constructs and prospects for education in the region. This has involved interrogating and challenging the current paradigm of education, planning, curriculum development, and pedagogies for teaching and learning in the region. While it is true that the call for a renewed perspective in education has been significantly influenced by the current global pandemic, we must conclude that this crisis has also offered an opportunity. I do not like to use opportunity in the framework of the pandemic, but I do have to say that we have been able to recognize new challenges, improve human and planetary sustainability, strengthen citizenship and participation, increase work and economic security, and fortify knowledge production, access, and governance in the Caribbean. UNESCO stands by the principle that knowledge and learning are humanity's most significant renewable resources. As such, the Futures of Education initiative have been a catalyst in mobilizing the collective intelligence of multiple stakeholders through a global consultative process. This will culminate in November 2021 with a report outlining a forward-looking policy agenda. This is a framework for policymakers and development agencies as well. We all seek to resolve critical environmental, social, and economic challenges faced by the communities we serve. UNESCO commends our education actors and stakeholders in the Caribbean, some of whom are present today, for responding to specific issues such as disruptions caused by the COVID-19 pandemic in a decisive and inclusive manner, while also confronting other relevant challenges such as unequal access to quality education, disengagement from learning, youth unemployment, and equal access to higher learning. Above all, we do understand, we do promote and protect education as a fundamental human right. As leaders in education, we are expected to also take an elevated viewpoint to the urgent demand for resilient education systems, focusing on holistic issues that affect people, planet, prosperity, peace, and partnership. We are collectively challenged to build competencies and capacities to address the vulnerability of the Caribbean seas to the increasing effects of climate change and extreme weather events, to ensure access and opportunity for all citizens, especially youth and most vulnerable, to become active and empowered participants in shaping their own futures as global citizens, to bridge the gaps in human talent and human capital. It's called human capital, I prefer to call it human talent, but it is human capital. Through access to high quality education, as well as advancing technical and vocational training that is responsive to labor market trends and emerging technologies. To accomplish this, we must all work together: education, private sector, academia, civil society, and beneficiaries. This requires moving away from a sectoral and disconnected, fragmented approach to thinking, planning, executing towards a more holistic, interdisciplinary, and sustainable partnership. To actually give a renewed sense to the Sustainable Development Goal 17 partnership, in the framework of the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. Together we plan, together we face the challenges, together we navigate the risks. Colleagues, we are indeed at a turning point in humanity, which is accelerated by the current health crisis, with a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to positively shape the future, to build a new global solidarity. Education is the underpinning vehicle that can shift mindset, transform behaviors, and enrich life. UNESCO takes this opportunity to congratulate the tremendous efforts and achievements made by our Caribbean partners towards attainment of the Education 2030 agenda. We are confident that your contribution and participation in this webinar series will strengthen policies and strategies in the education mechanism to better serve beneficiaries and stakeholders in an increasingly complex, diverse, and interconnected global community. We are honored to have hosted this timely initiative and look forward to greater synergies as we rethink and reframe the futures of education in the Caribbean. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you so much, Director. Thank you. At this point, we will invite to moderate the next segment, Dr. Laurent Bristol. We thank Laurent, who has been a part of the UNESCO team in the terms that she has supported many of our webinars, our presentations, our plannings as we have been moving forward as a region. Dr. Bristol is representing CARICOM, and we want to show our appreciation for your involvement, for your collaboration, even as we continue to shape the futures of education in the Caribbean. Over to you, Dr. Bristol.
Thank you, Latoya, and thank you, Dr. Sanchez. It's an honor, as usual, for the CARICOM Secretariat to collaborate with you, the UNESCO Santiago office. My pleasure is very simple this morning, is to introduce Dr. Didicus Jules, and I know that it will be worth the time that you invest. You know, I've always said to Dr. Jules, every time I listen to him, I learn something new, and it causes me to think differently about the thing that I so love, which is education. Dr. Sanchez talked about the ways in which education is needed for us to shift cultures and transform mindsets. And certainly Dr. Jules, historically over time, given his wealth of experience, currently he's the Director General for the Organization of the Eastern Caribbean States, and he has a wealth of experience at the regional and international level, which has been focused for a number of years on the whole question of education, social policy, and organizational transformation. Dr. Jules, we look forward to the interrogation and the journey that you will take us through as you share with us some of your ideas around what's needed as we think about this question of the future of education. Dr. Jules, over to you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Laurent and colleagues. I hope you're all keeping well, you and your families. I want to first of all congratulate UNESCO for the work that they've done in pulling this webinar and the series on the futures of education. I think one of the really impressive strengths of UNESCO is this crowdsourcing of ideas, going as far back as the future of education, when you came up with the pillars of education, the imperatives of education. And it continues in that tradition. The question of knowledge production, access, and governance is, in my view, a really critical consideration in looking at where do we go next with education in the context of the new normal and the post-pandemic world. Because the changes in the modality of education are challenging us now to look also at the content and the pedagogy of education. How do we get our messages across? I want to start with the first proposition being to make an important distinction between knowledge and information. Information, as we all know, is data, facts that exist as part of empirical reality that is subject to interpretation in order to find meaning. Knowledge, on the other hand, is the application of information to human activity and is in fact the product of that process. So it is us interacting with the objective facts and statistics and so on and coming to conclusions that lead us to a higher order of thinking. And I'm reminded of Confucius's statement that the essence of knowledge is having it to apply it, not having it to confess your ignorance. So examined from this perspective, I think we can identify a fundamental weakness of education in the Caribbean. The dominant pedagogies in our school systems are processes that really focus on the transfer of information. I mean, while we rhetorically say that education is about the assimilation of knowledge, that is contradicted by the pedagogies that we use. It all involves still a lot of rote learning, cramming of facts, dates, and figures. In other words, it's about the digestion of information. In order to shift the paradigm, we need instead pedagogies of engagement that I think have been well encompassed in the Freirean admonition, and I quote Paulo Freire here, that by doing we learn, and by learning we do better. So information ultimately makes sense when it is placed in that context, when it is applied in practice, when it is critically digested through praxis, critical reflection on the experience of applying information and the method to achieve the desired outcomes. The second proposition that I want to put to us is that full access and inclusive practices are integral to the realization of the purpose of education in society. So if we accept the Dewey's conception of education as a process for building human civilization and shaping the fullest integral development of the human person, and I notice Director Shan says in her presentation spoke not to education so much as human capital, but as human talent. And I think, you know, that's an important caveat. So if we think of education as shaping the fullest and integral human development of the human person, then access to education is essential. And well, when we talk about education in this context, we're talking essentially about schooling as the main vehicle. So if we see schooling as the principal vehicle or the site for the exercise of that function, then schooling has to embrace that holistic view of the purpose of education. Any society that does not take an inclusive approach, therefore, and guarantees full access to education stroke schooling is creating a stratification essentially between those who know and those who don't. That is inimical to releasing the full human potential of its people. And this is one of the reasons why, to give kudos to CARICOM, the Caribbean has adopted as the key objective of education the development of the ideal Caribbean person. To speak frankly, honestly, despite this path-breaking work by UNESCO, I think educators in the region generally have not embraced and taken it down through the levels of the system, the conception of the ideal Caribbean person, because that ought to be our lodestar through which everything we do is geared towards that realization. So it raises the question, how can school systems ensure full inclusion, full access and inclusion? The universality of education at all levels, while one must necessarily be prepared to transition from one level to the next, access cannot be restricted by the availability of space or by competitive ranking as we tend to do in the days of the common entrance exam. But instead access has to be guaranteed by successful mastery of the preceding and the foundational requirements for success. In other words, rather than base transition, for example, from primary to secondary on simply a common entrance exam that is a one-shot do or die exam, which incidentally has been replaced by CXC, by the Caribbean Primary Exit Exam, which is more process than competitive end product. We need instead to look at whether persons have actually mastered the competencies and the skills required to be successful at the next level of transition. What does that mean in practice? It means ensuring, first of all, universal access to early primary development programs. And note, I'm talking about programs, so not necessarily building new preschools, especially in the new normal. The construction of physical edifices may well be a thing of the past, but more effective early childhood development programs, such as the Roving Caregivers Program that was developed in Jamaica. In practice, it also means that for access to secondary, we need to abandon the old common entrance model and move more towards the Caribbean primary assessment, the CPEA. Neither competition for limited spaces nor automatic movement into secondary school without having the foundational competencies for success at the secondary level. And in practice, it also means that the pedagogy of the system must cater for the 7 styles of learning so that we focus on more effective learning and the cultivation of talent. How am I doing time-wise? So there's some measure.
Yeah, when Latoya turns her camera on, that tells you have a minute or two again.
Yes.
Okay, great. So I move now to the measures to introduce, to reduce inequality in the school systems. There are three basic measures that need to be taken. One are measures designed to address socioeconomic difference, and some of these measures are already in place, such as school feeding programs and provision of textbooks, uniforms, learning device access to disadvantaged kids. The second set of, and we need to think through in the context of the new normal, what are some of those new measures that need now to be introduced, especially with a lot of learning going online. Measures to address learning differentials need to be put in place. And these would have to do with a more creative approach to addressing learning deficiencies and supplemental learning programs. And lastly, measures to reduce elitism between the schools. So there we need to make, and that is a huge bugbear in education in the Caribbean, the question of elitism that has historically textured our education systems. A deliberate effort to improve the standards of all schools so that they achieve top performing status. A focus on the quality of school infrastructure, standards, the quality of teachers, the engagement of parents. And I must say this is work being addressed by CARICOM through the working group on the new Caribbean school that many of us on this call are part of. Then lastly, move towards the zoning of schools, but that can only be done when schools have achieved more or less a comparable standard of quality, plus building virtual instructional capability for all schools, because in the future I foresee our schools will just be physical edifices that will engage in particular learning activities, but a lot of the learning is going to be happening online. So every school may have a physical compound, but it also has a virtual avatar. That, given my time, is what I'd like to present. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jules. Really appreciate it. And of course, as usual, you're causing us to think differently about what we mean when we think about education. And it's not the traditional way of transitioning knowledge from in a linear process from one person to another, assuming that the other is tabula rasa, but really thinking about the contextual relations that is about nurturing the human being, that question of the ideal Caribbean person, recognizing that the intentions of education is not a means in of itself, but it's an intention towards the promotion and development of society and the ways in which individuals contribute to that society, and society contributes to the development of that individual and that reciprocal arrangement. It's now my honor then, and I know that there are many questions that will be coming in the question and answer segment. So with that, I hand over to my colleague Marva, who is the SG for the UNESCO National Commission of Curacao, Ms. Marva Brown, to manage the next segment. So over to you, Marva.
Thank you, Laurette. Good morning on my part also. Before we continue, I would like to introduce our next presenter, who is Mrs. Green, Ezra Jonna Green. She is an educator for 30 years and presently serves in the capacity of Deputy Director of Education. She is also a former principal and a part-time lecturer at the Antigua State College Teacher Education Department. She has served on several education committees for Antigua and Barbuda and also facilitated several throughout the Caribbean to include St. Kitts and Nevis, Jamaica, Bahamas, Grenada, St. Lucia, just to mention a few. Mrs. Green earned a Bachelor of Science degree in Business Education from Skidmore College and a master's degree in education from Walden University, and is presently pursuing her doctoral degree from the Walden University. She is also an intrinsically motivated individual who believes that excellence in performance and ethic is a fundamental attribute of a good educator. So we know what we will expect in her presentation. And while she is presenting, I would like for the participants to take into account the key questions, just to mention a few: what the role of marginalized groups play in the design and implementation of the curriculum within countries, what are the policies and programs of governments, the roles of the schools, and the cultural factors. So while Ezra Jonna Green presents, to take these questions into account. Mrs. Green, the floor is yours.
Thank you kindly. I appreciate being invited here today, and based on what Dr. Jules would have said, we would have to appreciate that knowledge, access, and governance has been the source of research for decades. All in academia appreciate the importance of knowledge sharing in the success of organizations and specifically education systems. However, getting a community of learners to participate in knowledge sharing has become a difficult proposition, especially for small island developing states. I wish to examine briefly 3 issues: cultural diversity, access to marginalized groups, and access to higher education. Although many report that they are culturally inclusive, it is generally demonstrated by superficial activities such as Black History concerts, Spanish food fairs, that do not really address the real issues of inclusion. To achieve cultural diversity, school systems must make a calculated effort to change mindsets. Within the context of Antigua and Barbuda, because our population is generally not divided along lines of ethnicity, the issues associated with cultural diversity, they are minimized. And I am of the express view that cultural diversity has not received the type of traction it deserves. The issue of diversity has to be tackled from our early childhood development centers if it is going to have any impact on our society. I also believe that there is much work to be done in the area of how we deal with marginalized groups and the role they play in the design and implementation of the curriculum. I would like to share a personal narrative with you. My personal assistant is blind. In preparation for this discussion, I asked her whether she felt marginalized. She said that as a blind woman, she has always felt marginalized. Access, she noted, was her greatest difficulty. For whereas she felt that at the professional level, she was being challenged, at the human level, her basic needs and rights were often taken from her. I asked in what regard? Her response: in everything in life. Access to basic bathroom facilities for the disabled, even within schools, transportation, ATM services. She went on and on. I listened empathetically, but eventually asked her, how do you think we could reduce this reality for persons who feel marginalized? Interestingly, she said, with education. I thought a little bit about what she had so passionately articulated. You see, if we address the issue of marginalization of disadvantaged groups from the curriculum, we open up the gateway to resolving, if not all, but some of those issues. Our curriculum is the knowledge sharing point for our future generation. When we teach, what we teach and how we do it will make a difference in how our students perceive and treat marginalized groups. She also said something very profound. She said, I think my greatest problem is that decisions are often made for us, about us, without consulting with us. It dawned on me that we have not inclusively designed or implemented our curriculum from the perspective of this or any marginalized group, at least in Antigua and Barbuda. Caribbean states must be inclusive in their design and implementation of the curriculum. Within my country, we have not included marginalized groups in the conversation when we are reforming or redesigning our curriculum. Even at the regional level, we have not designed curriculum or assessment with marginalized groups in mind. Let's take CXC for instance. How have we differentiated assessment to cater to the needs of that group or any group? That conversation has to start now if it has not already started. But more importantly, it must be inclusive of marginalized groups. Lastly, I wish to speak on the issue of access to higher education. In Antigua and Barbuda, we have had to re-envision our community colleges and other institutions of continuing education. With the advent of UE 5 Islands campus coming on board, those institutions had to rethink whom they attract. As a large proportion of school leavers, they are opting to go straight to UE as the entry requirement is the same. That in itself and of itself is not a disadvantage in my view, but an opportunity to improve access to higher education for a wider cross-section of the population in the following ways. Firstly, there is a need to ensure greater synergy between institutions within one country. That collaboration would reduce costs and allow for greater efficiency of service and more capital to offer new programs. Secondly, the opening of the UE 5 Islands campus brought to the fore the need to diversify course offerings within community college, which lend itself to engendering lifelong learning. Those institutions are now looking to the private sector to design and deliver courses specific to their needs. Finally, we are presently working on an exit plan for secondary schools that would allow more students into continuing education institutions. Universal secondary education has increased enrollment in secondary schools, but has also created a situation where the most vulnerable drop out. Through this exit plan, we are in the process of creating a school to continuing education institution link that would start at the secondary school, but end at the tertiary or continuing education institution. That tiered system would ensure that the majority of students graduate from secondary schools, but into different pathways. Ladies and gentlemen, we have to be creative in the way we attract persons to higher education and the way in which we think about knowledge production, access, and its government. I think my 5 minutes is up. Thank you kindly.
Yes, thank you very much, Ms. Dr. Green. We're now open for the questions and answer section. And just recapping what Dr. Green brought forward, what really stood out in your presentation was the part of the inclusion and access to others who do not have the ability, and the example that you brought of your assistant. So here we see that the inclusion part is very important for those who do not have that access, and then they're still in a way limited to receiving that access and also to being completely included in what is going on by not asking their input also. Latoya, will you be monitoring the questions in the Q&A? Okay, yes. I see that we have, yeah.
Yes, Secretary General, yes, we do. Okay. So we do have some comments in the Q&A, but no specific question yet. around the previous presentations, but we are inviting persons to share their questions, their comments. I'm sure that given the richness of the presentation so far, that persons are still considering, still digesting what has been shared. So SG, if there are some questions that you want to ask specifically, please, we invite that as well.
How do cultural factors affect the ability of Caribbean states to engage in knowledge sharing and collaboration towards solving systemic problems such as crime, corruption, and reducing inequality? I know that Dr. Green's time is limited, so maybe you would like to answer this question, and then I could ask Dr. Jules also to give his remark on that.
Okay, all right.
Dr. Green?
From our perspective, what we have noted is that the issue of cultural diversity is something that we really have to look at, and ensuring that our people in general appreciate other persons from different cultures. It actually creates a situation where persons are together, if you want to put it that way, and that the issues of crime, because I recently did a piece of research on behalf of the Cabinet of Antigua and Barbuda, and what we would have noted is that students who generally complete secondary school, or even those persons who would have gone through higher education, the possibility and propensity of them actually getting involved with crimes and different levels of crime, it was grossly reduced. So even the issue of including cultural diversity issues and marginalization, and ensuring that there's no marginalization within the curriculum itself, what we're actually doing, we are teaching our people to become more culturally aware, and we are teaching our people to become more acceptant of other persons from other cultures and other areas. Like I would have said before, the issue of cultural diversity and ethnicity is not such a big problem in Antigua and Barbuda, because we do not have persons from a wide range of cultures. But we have actually seen that by actually including it in our curriculum or in the conversation, we are actually getting persons to be more acceptant of other persons of different cultures and different people.
Thank you. Dr. Jules, would you like to react to that question?
Yes, certainly.
Your microphone.
Yeah, can you hear me now? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, certainly. I really want to compliment Dr. Green for her presentation before I respond, because I think her narrative about her personal assistant really brought the whole issue to life in a tangible way. And relatedly, I think when she spoke about, I noted in the comments, somebody said about the need for assessment to be brought in line. CXC does have a provision for the differently able to participate in the assessment and the examination process. So regardless of the subject, grading can be done of the papers, but that needs to be registered at the time when they are signing up for subjects. So just for information. With respect to the cultural factors, I want to take it from a different angle, complementing what Dr. Green said, because I think it all starts with the schools and how our students are educated. She spoke to that. But the key point here is that we have been taught to compete and not to cooperate. And that is a deep cultural factor that translates into our whole approach to work, to life, and so on. And that's why, I mean, anecdotally, we say Caribbean people, if you notice, not to be ethnic about it, but there are some ethnicities in the Caribbean who work together, they invest together, they adopt more cooperative approaches, and they do better economically. We always believe in competing. So if we see somebody at the level of, we see that all the time with micro enterprises, somebody comes up with a brilliant idea, maybe creating natural fruit ice lollies, and they start to make money and the business is booming. And immediately 20, 30 other people get into a complete copy of the same thing. And again, what are the options there? Can we, for example, and that's some of the challenges we are looking at the OECS at a broader level, in terms of creating a more vibrant entrepreneurial ecosystem. How can we get people who are on the same wavelength, the same idea, come together, form a business, create shares, become a wider entity that can actually go confidently out there into the market? So critically, our schools have to teach us to cooperate and not to compete. And that can be done through, aside from what we do at the pedagogical level, more collaborative projects, peer learning, peer support in the schools. CXC actually has data that psychometrically shows from when we did the pilot of the, I'm still saying we because I'll forever be part of that family. But when we did the pilot on the Caribbean Primary Exit Assessment, that children actually learn better from their peers than from their teachers. And that is how in a diverse classroom, you can use the so-called brighter students to help teach the slower ones. And what happens is that the brighter ones are reinforced in their genius, and the slower ones learn faster and better. And it creates a different ambience in the classroom. So the adoption also of problem-solving project assignments that could focus on community and social problems. Let us make the challenges of the community at a grassroots level become also the problematic for the schools to help resolve. And this has been done in the Caribbean before. I worked in the Grenada Revolution, and one of the things we did in education there, at the level, every school in Grenada at the time was turned, by day it was a primary or secondary school, by night it became an adult education center. So the schools were used 24/7. And in addition to that, the curriculum in the schools focused on, there was a huge component in the curriculum where the learners had to go out into the community, identify community problems. That became part of the learning process. So understand what the problems are, do the research and so on, and to brainstorm on what could be done at the level of the community or with the support of the state in order to resolve those problems. So it got tied into the community work day that was held usually on a Sunday, where people went out and did community service. So there are distinct ways of addressing this problem in very practical ways.
Thank you, Dr. Jules. I see that Latoya is on the screen, which means that this section's time is up.
Almost,
right?
Almost. There is one more question around, well, a question around inclusion and two separate questions, but coming together, it's about inclusion as it relates to the use of local languages. So this is something that I know Deputy Director Green may have to leave soon, but even to SG Jules around inclusion of local languages, just how we can treat with that as a region, as well as inclusion of those persons who have, I see here, they said mental challenges as well, and how we plan to treat with that. This is something that is also at play in our education system. Yes. So, SG, I don't know if
yes.
Question too.
Yes. Would Dr. Jules like to answer that question?
No, I would like to answer. I would like to answer it, but I would give the floor to Dr. Green, because she did say she may have to leave earlier. So after.
Yes.
Yes, I'm sorry, I just got distracted into my other meeting because I'm struggling 2 meetings at the same time. I'm sorry. Yes, inclusion, as you would have mentioned, is extremely important. And unless we begin from the perspective of the young growing up, we would never be able to achieve the goal of true inclusion. We will never, oh my.
I think that we momentarily lost Dr. Green. So maybe her connection broke. So in the meanwhile,
Yeah, I will
please?
present, and I will yield the floor when she comes back. I want to say, with respect to marginalization, that we need to make a distinction, which I think is important. When we talk about people being marginalized, to me, there are two kinds of marginalization. There is what I call invisible marginalization, and there's the structural marginalization. Invisible marginalization are people like the deaf, the mentally ill, those with the differently abled, because they are there. Even when we provide schools for, say, the differently abled, I'm not sure to what extent as an education system, we have really grappled with the meaning of the marginalization, and how I know in some of the schools, because like in the school for the deaf or the blind, you would have pedagogies cater into that. But I don't know that we have really gone deep enough into the nature of that invisible marginalization and how it translates, as Dr. Green indicated, while her assistant does not feel marginalized in some respects in the workplace because it caters for her. In life in general, she is treated invisibly. So a lot is not happening there. So that needs to be addressed. The other thing from the socioeconomic perspective, it has to do with marginalization coming from poverty, whereas socioeconomic status, religious affiliation, political affiliation, all of these things need to be brought on board if we are to effectively address that issue. And even as was pointed out by the colleague, linguistic marginalization is critical too, because I mean, we have treated, for us, languages in the Caribbean are the officially recognized languages, not the spoken languages, which is another huge form of invisible marginalization. So French, you know, we teach French in all the schools. We have Francophone, we have part of the Creole world in the Caribbean, Haiti, all St. Lucia, some pockets of Grenada, pockets of Trinidad and Tobago, Martinique, Guadeloupe. In the OECS, for example, Martinique and Guadeloupe have are equivalent to the population of these countries moves us from 1 million in the Anglophone Caribbean, 600,000 in the Anglophone OECS to 1.5 million when you include Martinique and Guadeloupe. So automatically, Creole has to be the glue that brings the English speaking, because Grenada, St. Lucia, Dominica are also involved in Creole language speaking to widen the whole inclusion. And again, sometimes the effort to deal with marginalization is stymied by the political developments in the country. I know for years when I was at CXC, we had actually been part of a CARICOM delegation that went to Haiti to discuss ways of deepening functional collaboration with Haiti. And CXC was part of that delegation. We actually made a presentation to the Cabinet of Ministers of Haiti in Creole, in Haitian Creole, speaking to the opportunities of inclusion in CXC. Now, there were many low-hanging fruit and points of immediate entry. So we could offer French and English in thing. We will look in as part of the subject offerings to Haiti, because they do that in their secondary curriculum. We could also begin to offer Haitian Creole, and well, Creole in general. There's slight differences, but there's an Antillean Creole that could work for across the space. Offer Antillean Creole, and for that we'd have to rely very heavily on educators from Haiti, Dominica, St. Lucia to be part of that. And the groundwork for that already exists. And then we felt, given the world-class recognition of Haitian art, registering Haitian students to do art would be an immediate boost to the subject across the entire Caribbean because of the quality of the inputs that we would receive. So these are some ideas in terms of how we can address the issue of marginalization. And I think the starting point is to differentiate the types of marginalization and how they manifest themselves at all levels, whether it be economic levels, political levels, community levels, and so on.
You're muted, SG. You're muted.
Sorry about that. Seeing that our time is up, I would gladly like to thank Dr. Jules and also Dr. Green for their very powerful presentations. And we will now continue to my colleague Laurent Bristol, who will now moderate the roundtable for reflections on futures of education in Caribbean states. Laurent?
Thank you, Marva. Really appreciate it. Very interesting conversations, issues that we have to continue, I think, to interrogate. We cannot begin to speak of education futures without having to embrace some of the difficult questions that we have to navigate. So I think we have started that journey and there is more ways to go. We'll continue that journey of interrogating notions of education, notions of human development, and particularly reflecting on futures of education in the Caribbean, small island developing states. And we have 4 persons who are going to make contributions. In terms of their contributions, I'm sure they're going to give us some trigger points, some questions that we will salivate over as we move on and engage in the next segment of Q&A. So we have joining us on this roundtable, Mr. Sean Powers, who's an economist, educational global practice at the World Bank, Dr. Howard Hamilton, who's a data management and information technology expert, Dr. Knut Thompson, who is the head of the Caribbean Center for Educational Planning at the University of the West Indies Mona campus, and Ms. Michaela Gonzalez, who's going to provide the youth perspective for Jamaica. This is according to my agenda. Am I leaving anybody out, Latoya?
No, you're not, Laurent. Thank you. We have 4 persons. Yes.
So our 4 persons on this panel will share their perspectives for 3 minutes, and they will go in that order. Sean, Howard, Knut, and Michaela will share for 3 minutes. And I'm going to count on Latoya to turn her camera on at the 3-minute point. So when you see Latoya's picture, please know that your time is approaching up. So we'll start with Mr. Sean Powers. Share with us your perspectives on the futures of education in the Caribbean states. Mr. Sean?
Thank you so much for having me. Good morning and greetings to everyone from very snowy Washington, D.C. I'm particularly missing my travels to the Caribbean on a day like today. So I think this is a wonderful conversation so far. I wanted to talk a little bit about curriculum because I think it's a doorway to touch on many of the themes that have already been raised. I work with a global institution, and so one of the advantages that comes with that is getting to see some of the trends in different regions of the world. And I think one of the biggest stylized facts that we can see across many different regions is that the curriculum is really not designed for most students. It's not designed for the average student. It's not designed for disadvantaged students. Rather, curriculum very often and learning standards are a legacy of a colonial history where the purpose of the system of education, at least implicitly, is more about selection than about learning. Abhijit Banerjee, the Nobel laureate, described this once as picking winners and helping them win. And in my dialogue with countries, you know, I never come in assuming that any particular global trend is going to apply, but when I've mentioned this to different governments and other stakeholders in the Caribbean, more often than not, I hear that this resonates. So I think in terms of the current COVID crisis, there's actually potentially a blessing in disguise with respect to curriculum, that this is an opportunity to reset. It's an opportunity to go back to basics, to think about what are the real fundamental skills that are needed for successful participation in society, in the 21st century economy, for the development of the whole person. And so I would really urge that we not let the opportunity that's embedded in this crisis to go to waste. Thinking about how to approach curriculum, I think there's several important things to keep in mind. One is the critical importance of consultation. Ezra, I think earlier referred to the phrase, nothing about us without us. In Guyana, for instance, we were working on a curriculum reform, and one of the very important measures that the Ministry of Education took was to work closely with the Ministry of Amerindian Affairs, to work with organizations representing the indigenous peoples of Guyana to include them in the development of the framework, inclusion of Amerindian people as master trainers for the curriculum, and also to go back to one of the recurring themes, the treatment of indigenous languages, that where teachers had the facility to teach in indigenous languages, that would be preferred, but at very minimum, if the teacher didn't have those skills, students' expression in their home language was not to be discouraged as it had been in the past. It's also very important to analyze the representation, the way that different persons are represented in textbooks, in curriculum, in the types of examples that teachers give in classrooms. We should also take what we call the twin track approach, which is including in our curriculum design and professional development both specific actions that are designed for greater inclusion. So for instance, this might include accommodations for students with different types of disabilities, but also to more generally try to foster an inclusive environment that doesn't leave any student behind. And the last part that I wanted to mention is monitoring, evaluation, and learning. I think it's very important, going back to this idea of culture, is to strive to undertake a cultural shift toward a culture of learning, and to not only be learning institutions, but also be institutions that learn. And of course, in the context of COVID-19, we've all had to learn very, very quickly. And this is very difficult. I'm not trying to minimize the challenges that are involved here, but I think one framework that I find helpful is Dean Carlin, who's an academic at Northwestern University, calls this the Goldilocks challenge. So I assume everyone is familiar, sorry, I shouldn't assume. In case you aren't familiar, you know, the story of Goldilocks is about a young girl who comes into the home of these three bears, and basically everything is either too hot, too cold, or just right, too hard, too soft, or just right. There's a sort of just right approach where we collect the information that we'll actually use. We don't collect information if we're not going to actually do something with it. We look for synergies between you know, teacher professional development and data collection. So one really good example of this that we've worked on in several countries is using teachers to apply the child functioning module, which was developed by UNICEF to help gather reliable data on the prevalence of disability. This is a tool that focuses on functioning rather than diagnosis, rather than on labeling children. And it both can collect information for policymakers to be able to use to design more inclusive systems, but also help make children with disabilities more visible to teachers and encourage them to make those accommodations in their classroom. So that went by very quickly. So I look forward to the rest of the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sean, and particularly where you ended, the just right approach, as we would have said in the different island states, we'd have talked about IRE and understanding about appropriateness and relevance, which are critical issues for us to consider as we think about how we go forward. And now I'd like to welcome Dr. Howard Hamilton to give his perspective for 3 minutes. Dr. Hamilton.
Yes, thank you so much, and I'm also very happy to participate in this webinar. I just want to probably just pick up from where Sean left off. He mentioned a number of things here, some of which looks at the data side of the education system. I've been looking for some time on some of the trends that are happening within the education system. And there are a few points I want to make from a report, an EDUCAUSE report, that speak to some of the trends that we're seeing in the education system, and we can then see how this links back to what we're doing in the Caribbean. So there are a few things here. One of the points here is rethinking how institutions work. I think a lot of what we've been talking about so far in order to achieve some of these proposals and ideas that are being put forth, this is one area that we may need to be looking at, and I think this is a trend across not just the Caribbean but many other areas where, you know, one is now looking at how we operate as an education system. Another trend we can probably look at is the focus on measuring learning, and I know Sean highlighted that as well, looking at monitoring learning. How do we measure learning? How do we assess, for instance, students' success? I mean, the idea of student success has been out there for a while, and in many places we look at student success as to how they perform within the schools. But I think there's a trend that is happening now where we need to not just measure success in schools, but also, you know, once the student leaves the school system, what happens to that student? So student success may pretty much, you know, move from you know, pre to post graduation levels as well. Another trend I think we probably need to be looking at is the redesigning of learning spaces. Many education systems are really looking at how we learn, how the environment is set up for learning. We probably need to look at more active learning classrooms, for instance. I heard Dr. Jules mentioned earlier about that children learn better from their peers than from teachers. Do we need to make sure that we have more collaborative design processes to help that kind of learning? I know we have, you know, several challenges that we have to deal with, and some of these challenges could include, for instance, how do we improve digital fluency? And I'm looking at, again, how we can utilize some of the technologies we have to improve how we deliver instruction and how we improve student success. Digital fluency is pretty important. In the classroom, we're talking about probably looking at not just students when it comes on to digital fluency, but also our instructors within the classrooms as well. That seemed to be one of the challenges. We know it's solvable, but we still see some challenges in that area. The other challenge that we're facing, I think, is how do we measure, you know, things like achievement gaps? We talk about different cultures within our environments and different students that we have to accommodate and the whole inclusiveness of our education system. But, you know, are we at least within our environments making sure that we have, or we're capturing the data that can help us to do some amount of studies on the different achievement gaps that we're having. Another challenge I think we face is how do we advance digital equity? This is something that many education systems are actually grappling with. And I think it's one of the challenges we need to put on the table. There are many reports that refer to this challenge as a wicked challenge because it is very complex even to look at, you know, designing this solution for. I just want to mention some of the discussions that have gone. I'm coming down now. That have gone forth earlier about, for instance, mobile learning. This is another area, I think. I mean, a lot of education systems are doing well here, but again, we are doing better probably with the applications we're using, but we have challenges with connectivity and the convenience of the learning content itself. So these are just some of the areas I just want to put on the table that we can think about. And I know my time is up. I see Latoya.
Thank you very much, Howard. Really appreciated the whole question of how do we measure success? And I think that's the conversation that we've been having so far. The whole, very important comparison between competition and collaboration, and it's a fundamental challenge facing us. And the notion of digital fluency and equity, and we need to, you call it a wicked question. And these are the issues that we will continue to address, and hopefully we'll come up with some responses to them. We move next to Dr. Knut Thompson, who will share his perspectives for 3 minutes. Knut, as I indicated before, is the head of the Caribbean Center for Educational Planning at the University of the West Indies. So Knut, over to you.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and good morning to everyone. Just like to begin by affirming some key points that were made by the previous speakers. The issue of how youngsters learn, the related issue of how we manage and structure learning spaces, using problem solving as a base for developing critical skills, and finding the just right formula. A couple of buzzwords that come to mind as we think about education for the future. The traditional words and the heavily used words, technology, innovative learning, digital natives, digital campuses. And when we put those things together, the question we need to ask ourselves is, how do millennials learn? And I think some of the answers have been advanced by the words that I mentioned from the previous speakers. But there are a couple other critical issues that I think should inform our outlook on and attempt to shape learning for tomorrow. The issue of multilingualism, the importance of new forms of assessment, constructing new standards and new approaches to academic measurement of academic performance, personalizing the learning experience, new forms of certification, and critically, what may be referred to as mobile or self-directed learning, and the importance of networks for learning. So there are three key things that I would like to highlight from all of this that I think is should define how we direct the future. The first is to challenge our regional governments to commit heavy resources to building out our digital infrastructure. There was a time when seeking funding to put up large buildings, whether they be accommodation halls, halls of residence, or central headquarters, that was the necessary thing for that era. We have now moved to the location where cell towers and mobile network support systems are the critical underpinnings for learning and for development. The second critical element I suggest is how we retrain our teachers to become facilitators of learning. My good friend Dr. Jules makes an important point that the study found that students learned better from each other. This calls for restructuring of the classroom setting. We have long spoken about collaborative learning, but many of our schoolrooms are so structured that desks and chairs are bolted to the ground. We'll have to exercise the courage of knocking those buildings down and redesigning them. The good news though is that we don't have to knock them down. We simply might need to use them for locations on which the teachers operate, because students will be able now to operate in a space of self-directed learning with a new form of teacher facilitation and mentor support. The third critical thing I think we need to look at is, what do we measure as students' attainment of the key skills that the school provides? And I think the notion of subjects passed at the CXC will need to be revised. We have to now look at the extent to which youngsters are able to create products, patent those products, and develop relationships that allow them to engage in business undertakings at an early age. These will have to be some of the areas that we emphasize. I think I'm gone for 4 minutes, so I'll stop there.
Thank you, Knut. Really appreciated that shift that we talk about. I think that would be the hardest work that we'd ever do. And if we ever get to that shift, we would have accomplished a lot. You know, I know that you spoke to the millennials, but I can't help but recognize that it's more than the millennials that we need to reach. We do know that they are driving a lot of the change in terms of how we interact with the world, but there is work to be done as well with the generations before who are still around and still shape in some positives and maybe not so positive ways sometimes, the ways in which the millennials go about approaching life. So learning today for life, I think is for me, the message that I got from your presentation. We'll move now to Michaela, Miss Michaela Gonzalez, and Michaela is a youth, presenting the youth perspective. You know, our colleague Knut was speaking to the youth just now, and it's always important to hear the voices of our young people, because a lot of times we think we know until they shine the torchlight and show us how much we don't know. So Michaela, share with us your perspective for 3 minutes. Looking forward to hearing from you.
No problem at all. But first of all, I just want to say thank you for having me here. You know, it's always a privilege every time I'm given the opportunity just to be on a platform to share the perspective of youth, especially when we're discussing issues about youth. So first of all, I've noticed that everybody has very clearly and, you know, in a very well thought out way, displayed what the challenges are. So for me, it's clear that everybody in the room, we have read the room correctly and we know what the challenges are. And so for my presentation, I think I want to present the perspective more so focused on some youth-led solutions, I would, you know, like to say. I'm going to break that down into 4 parts. And the first part is, you know, since the pandemic, I believe what it revealed, you know, especially to me as an educator, is that our current systems, they lack flexibility. So, you know, like for one solution, I'm thinking about the way that we test students. I think very quickly as we enter the pandemic, you know, and the CXC exams were still, you know, allowed to take place, we realized that is there another way that we could have used to test our students? Is it that, you know, it's only at the end of the 5-year period when they're in high school? Is it that we did not gather any information before that? Or is it that we can start gathering information in terms of, you know, I heard Dr. Jules talking about their competencies, you know, and not just, okay, have we transferred the knowledge to them, but we must have, you know, been assessing the application of that knowledge throughout the 5 years. And if that's not something we're currently doing, you know, that's something I think we could very quickly incorporate rather than just this one exam that you do at the end of the 5 years. You know, I also think about the teaching methods. So, you know, again, throughout the pandemic, I was very quickly, as even though I'm a young person, I had to adjust to teaching online. So I'm only 26 years old. However, I have been teaching for 6 years of my life and I absolutely love it. And, you know, but before the pandemic, it was always face-to-face. So yes, as a young person, it was very easy for me to transfer or, you know, go into using technology to teach. But then I realized, you know, speaking with a lot of the other teachers and colleagues that I knew, that, you know, just something as simple as, you know, using the right technology, whether it is the whiteboard or using certain tools like gamification in order to bring across, you know, certain concepts to students, because the thing is, they're no longer in the classroom. But I think something that we missed along the way was that we didn't have to let them feel like they were outside the classroom. So, you know, for a lot of teachers, what, you know, I realized is that they resorted to just sending YouTube videos or making PowerPoint presentations. And, you know, I know the person who spoke before me, sorry, I didn't get the name. He was referring to how is it that millennials learn? And if you want to know how we learn, you have to go into our spaces. So you think about, why does a TikTok, why do certain YouTube channels and podcasts, why do those things resonate with students? And it's because, or young people rather, it's because you're giving us just the right information that we need in the right amount of time. So, you know, what I've been realizing as a trend is that, whereas when I was even going to school and, you know, you go into the classroom and you sit down there and you get all these notes from the teachers, what the students want now is they want you to get to the point, tell them the information that they need to have, and then quickly allow them to start applying. But I realized that we have not fully transitioned into focusing more on application. And so now that our students, you know, they're more vibrant, they're more willing and to actually try new things, I don't believe we have fully adjusted to allowing our teaching methods to reflect that. So I think in terms of solutions, I think our teaching methods definitely need to start being more application based. You know, I also heard somebody speaking about being project based. That's also very important. And or you know, we think young people don't like group work. You know, that's actually even something that I realize a lot of my students, they actually do like, and I have successfully seen the brighter students, you know, teaching the, you know, ones that have, you know, different challenges, as you mentioned. I have seen that method work beautifully for my class. And so, you know, my students that are stronger, I allow them to maybe, you know, after I teach a concept, allow them to transfer that knowledge to their peers. And indeed, they do learn better from, you know, even their peers. I also want to, okay, I see some person, Dr. Jules making a comment there. Secondly, I want to go into the inclusion of youth and, you know, just saying that I know we speak about having, you know, youth at the table, and something that UNESCO has always done is to ensure that, as I said, you're speaking about young people and you have allowed me to be here to share those views. And so I'm not going to get into it, but I also definitely think in terms of solutions, mental health definitely needs to be on the table. That's something that is really affecting our young people in this time. And I'm not sure we have fully committed to putting that at the forefront of our solutions. And finally, entrepreneurship. I am a young entrepreneur, you know, who is pursuing specifically EdTech. And I believe that we need to foster this, I guess, zeal within our young people to not only be, you know, consumers of EdTech products, but now for us to develop products and services that can solve our solutions. I see, Latoya, I see you.
Thank you, Michaela. If we want to know what's going on with the youth and how youth learn, go into spaces where the youth dominate. And I think it's a very important signal to us that we cannot speak to a community that we wish to serve without really becoming familiar with that community. We would probably never be part of the community, obviously, for a number of reasons. We're two different generations, but we certainly need to become familiar. And the notion of that familiarity allows us to be empathetic, allows us to be a lot more sensitive, and allows us to respond in the ways that are needed, that are relevant and in time. So thank you very much, Michaela. So colleagues, we are at a moment now in our relationship and in this conversation where we have 15 minutes for questions, to continue to exchange and interrogate with each other. And I would also like to use this opportunity, with the permission of Latoya, to also bring Dr. Jules back into this conversation with the panelists. So I'd like all the panelists to turn their cameras on. I apologize again for not turning mine on, but it's the only way I can ensure that I stay connected with you all by managing my bandwidth. So if Dr. Jules as well can turn his camera back on, and Knut can turn his camera on, we have 15 minutes to engage with each other, and certainly begin to start to think about some of those less than easy questions to answer, because if we wanted the easy answers, I know certainly we would not have been involved in education. Latoya, are you seeing any questions in the Q&A section that we would want to pose to our panelists?
Yes, Laurent. And so we do have a question here, or a comment. The comment around languages that keeps on coming back. And I thank you, Dr. Jules, for having responded to that. I also see where there was a previous comment around curriculum as well, how we can better make sure that the curriculum is responsive to the current needs of the region, but also the future aspirations of education in the region. So we can start off, Loretta, I think that perhaps is a low-hanging fruit that we can start off with that one. Yeah, the issue around how the curriculum can be adaptable and future-oriented.
Right, that's fantastic, Latoya. And if we can get each of the panelists to kind of tackle that question very quickly in a very brief, succinct manner, and we go round. So I'll go in the order of appearance on my screen, starting from with the youth. Let's start with the youth this time. So Michaela, you're going to get first shot at this question.
Okay, no problem. So in relation to, ensuring that the curriculum is, more focused, I would say we definitely need to maybe do some more research in terms of what is happening globally. I know, yes, we have to make things very peculiar to our situations, in SIDS. However, I think it's for me, I'm very big on research as well. And so I think, you know, if there are things that are working in other, you know, places and, you know, globally, I think we should definitely take some time, and as well as the consultations, you know, with the current curriculum, maybe to know what is going right and wrong. Again, I will forever be an advocate of including young people, and not just young persons who are in the space right now, but previous persons, you know, we spoke about earlier, not just it being those who take the exam now, but where are they now? And so just very quickly, I guess I will add that, and then if I can add anything at the end, I will.
Thank you, Michaela. Howard, how about you? What's your perspective, and how do we future-proof and make more relevant our curriculum?
Yeah, so I think what we need to do is to develop a curriculum that target the skills and the competences that we need within our environment. I think over the years, we have been producing, if I may, students and graduates who, at the end of the day, they have good education. They're brilliant graduates, but at the same time, they're not able to fit in a meaningful way in the community or, you know, within the work environment. So we need to start at least looking at what the region needs, for instance, and make sure that you know, we focus on those skills. That's one of the reasons I mentioned, you know, looking at student success. How do we measure this? You know, what kind of metrics are we thinking about using to measure student success? Is it that we get the student within our system, you know, be it pre or post secondary, and student learns well, did pretty well, had good grades, and that's it. You know, our metric, in my view, should also include how the student progress after graduation. And we should have and start developing systems, you know, having the kind of data that we can track this, so we can do further research. We can use this information to improve our curriculum, improve the way we deliver instruction and learning. But you know, our curriculum should really be built in a way that support the student from the start to the end into their career. And again, focusing on not just the younger students, but also those, you know, who are parents, who have different agenda, different schedules, and different ways to learn. So it should be all encompassing, in my view. And like I said, you know, it should look at the entire life cycle of that student.
Thank you, Howard. Knut, what are your thoughts?
Chair, I begin with the observation that education should enable a society to answer a range of questions, starting with its most vexing and challenging questions. And when we take a look at the Caribbean society, per capita, Caribbean countries represent the largest number of countries that are in the top 10 most violent countries in the world. We're talking about Jamaica, Belize, St. Kitts, St. Lucia, per capita. And at the same time, we're turning out more graduates. More students are having access to high school, and more students are having access to tertiary education. But despite these improvements in educational opportunity, our levels of violence are greater than they were half a generation ago, 25 years ago, half a century ago, 50 years ago. So the question is, how should we, what are we not doing with our curriculum, or in our curriculum, such that we are failing to address the issues of personhood, the issue of relationships, the issues of citizenship, and the issue of productivity? Because for each person involved in violent crimes, we have fewer persons being involved in productive and developmental activity. So I think one of the things that the curriculum must address is the issue of how we transform the sense of self and generate a new kind of thinking that would lead our youngsters in a productive direction with their lives. The second thing I think we have to ask ourselves is, what are the kinds of strategies we use to assess performance under the curriculum? And I raised this earlier in my comments. But this might call not merely for looking at how we do well, what we're doing wrong. In other words, if there are problems in the curriculum, it's not to try to improve on what is wrong. How do we revolutionize and turn the curriculum upside down so that we are moving our societies in a different direction?
Thank you, President. And over to you, Sean.
Thank you. I agree with the other panelists' comments, and I thought maybe I would try to work in a response to one of the other questions I saw in the chat, which is about STEM. I strongly endorse what Howard said about focusing on skills. I think one of the big problems in curriculum is too much focus on content and insufficient focus on skills. So in STEM, for instance, give me graduates who can reason scientifically, who can think about cause and effect in a rigorous way, who know some basics about inference from statistics, for example, over graduates who have memorized lots of facts. I think that's extremely important, but it's easier to design a curriculum in terms of what facts, what content you need to cover, rather than the skills you need to inculcate. I live in the US, and we have an epidemic of misinformation right now in the US, and it's related to politics, to the COVID-19 pandemic. And a lot of that comes from that inability to reason in a scientific way. I think we also need to not lose track of teachers, the importance of teachers, teacher selection, teacher professional development. A lot of the teacher training that we do, including historically a lot financed by the World Bank, is not very good. We need the teacher professional development to emulate the kind of dynamic teaching that we want the teachers themselves to bring into the classroom. We need teacher training that is grounded in subject matter, like STEM, rather than being just about generalities about pedagogy. And I think we also need to think about the teaching profession and how to attract more and higher caliber people to become teachers. Everybody loves to talk about Finland as an example of a top performing education system. One of the things that Finland has done right is that teaching is a very, very prestigious and selective profession there. And so I think if we got more people in the region who have these STEM skills to choose teaching as a profession, whether early in their career or even as career switchers, I think that could also be of benefit. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Sean, and thanks as well for picking up some of the other issues that are popping up in the chat as I'm watching them in the chat, and because we were going to go next, the implications for teacher training, but you've addressed that. So I'll hand over to Didicus.
Yeah, thanks. Three points. One, to answer your question, I think we need to come back to the purpose of education. And that is to draw on what our UNESCO colleague said at in her opening remarks. It's about optimizing human talent, and it's about building civilization. Now, in that context, the curriculum becomes a focal point for focusing learning. And it raises a question that has been around since 1860 by Spencer: whose knowledge is of the most worth? And that ties into the theme of this thing. The second point is, what do we need to do in order to future-proof the curriculum? I believe all of the elements of the future shape of curriculum already exist in best practices across the region, in different initiatives that have been largely teacher-led and experimented, but it boils down to some very simple principles and objectives. The most important of which for me is making learning fun. And that might sound simple, but there's a huge problem of the disengagement of students with learning in schools. The Generation Z is a whole different ballgame in terms of the things that excite them, what engages them, and so on. So making learning fun will ensure that we engage students, we involve them, as Sean pointed out, in design and critical thinking, It's not just the concepts of science in STEM, it's making science happen. Discover science in everyday life. We also, part of that is to make learning globally challenging. And by globally challenging, I mean, let us not shortchange our students by believing that we're doing, yes, our education must be a Caribbean education, but at the same time, we have to make our students globally competitive. They have to be global citizens. So let's not, the challenges for their critical thinking, for their design thinking, must involve a focus on the local and the national, but it must also be fitted in the context of the global. And schools, therefore, have to become places of learning by doing, which speaks to the thing. Now, on the point of assessment, I agree with Dr. Hamilton, there is need for assessment, but again, we are ignoring the elements that already exist of future solutions. And it's, you know, it's really disheartening in a way to listen to some of the comments that have been made on this and other webinars in relation to CXC, because it seems as if people really have not understood what CXC is about or what it is trying to do. And if I sound unapologetic about CXC, no excuses for that, because I know the efforts that have been made. The idea of examinations as a one-size-fits-all, as examinations as a one event that is terminal, as examinations as, you know, packing everybody against the same yardstick, examinations as competition. These are all ideas that unfortunately have had a long sell-by date in the education system. But I know within CXC, the ideology of exams is guided by a quotation from one of the top international experts. He says that if students are more prescribed by examinations than described by them. That is the mantra of the old education paradigm. Now, if that is the case and it is reality, then let us flip that and say instead that if this is what's good, if that's an abiding and persistent ideology among educators in the Caribbean, then the mission of CXC that we had defined was to change it around so that we then help to create the type of students that people look to exams to describe. So that means, for example, I referenced earlier the Caribbean Primary Assessment because it's a very different type of exam. It's not a one-shot exam, it's not a 3-hour paper. There is a final examination, but the bulk of the exam, of the quote-unquote examination, the assessment process, is a process that spans 2 years of work in the classroom, where the classroom teacher, the students keep a portfolio, the pair teaching that we spoke about is part of that. In brevity, I invite you to look up CPEA on the CXC website and download the rubrics and so on that. But the point here, taken from Dr. Hamilton, he triggered the idea that one way of doing what he's proposing is for us to look at, aside from making those changes for the traditional exams to move more towards the CPEA model, but also to extend the idea of the portfolio. So that imagine a student from the beginning of their school, their higher education career. Instead of just doing exams in the new model, they also keep a portfolio of their work that will be illustrative of the creativity, the design thinking, the solutions orientation that the solutions they come with and so on. And that becomes, and again with blockchain technology, it's very easy to do, to ensure that the integrity of that is preserved, that it can be made available wide across the board. So I'm seeking a job, I can present my blockchain portfolio that shows my entire profile of not just the knowledge that I would have succeeded in gaining, but also my competencies, the creativity I've displayed. Even one can add the hobbies that engage me, because I know in some really high-end employment situations, people ask about hobbies not for conversation's sake. They ask for it to see how eclectic are your interests and what do your hobbies say about you. So I think what we're talking about here in terms of curriculum transformation, not reform, is very doable. And we have many of the elements and the components that already exist in the system that need themselves to be tweaked, in some cases repurposed, but to come with an entirely new conception of things.
Thank you very much, Lucas, and thank you very much to our panelists. And you know, the time flies when we are having fun and engaging with some very interesting issues, but our time is up now, and I will then now hand over to Ms. Cynthia Hobbs, Lead Education Specialist at the Inter-American Development Bank. Cynthia, over to you.
Thank you, Laurent, and thank you for this opportunity to share a few final remarks following this very rich discussion among the presenters and in the chat. I was invited to talk a little bit about how we're approaching these issues at the IDB and give a quick wrap-up. As you may know, the IDB is strongly committed to reducing inequality and creating opportunities for the most vulnerable people and communities across Latin America and the Caribbean. We finance research and education initiatives, partnering with local universities, researchers, and ministries of education. And the pandemic has shown us the important role that parents can play, so we're thinking about how to better support and engage them as well. It's by working together that we will continue to build our knowledge and develop pedagogies of engagement, as Didacus Jules referred to allow full access to our education community to learn and grow. We are in full agreement with Didacus' call to reduce elitism of schools and ensure that all schools offer their students equal opportunities in person and through distance modalities. There are some issues that we've been grappling with for decades in the Caribbean, such as lower education achievement of boys. And the IDB is currently engaged in an important regional study in the Caribbean that we hope will shed more light on gender gaps and gender biases in education, leading to recommendations for more inclusive practices. This study seeks to evaluate differences in education achievement of boys and girls in the English-speaking Caribbean by analyzing possible gender biases in curriculum, textbooks and other materials, teacher practices, links between school and work, and job opportunities for women and men. The study also involves a value-added analysis where we determine which secondary schools are better preparing students, both boys and girls, for post-secondary education and training. Once we know which schools add more value, we can analyze what those schools are doing differently, including possible differences in teaching methods, and share their good practices across the education system. The results of the study should shed more light on how to reduce inequalities in schools and in the workforce. Ezra Green talked to us about cultural diversity and inclusion of people from other cultures and abilities. And we talked about structural and silent marginalization, including linguistic marginalization. Sean Powers gave some good examples of greater inclusion of other languages and culture in curriculum and teaching. The IDB is investing in solutions for children in rural and indigenous communities in the Caribbean. In Suriname, we partnered with a local university professor to do a study on barriers to learning in the interior regions of the country. Through focus group interviews, we heard from indigenous and maroon communities who worked with us to identify areas for improvement in education programs that honor their culture and ways of learning. We will use those inputs to design a program using tablets with offline content in indigenous languages. And we have had initial discussions with Duolingo about the development of that content, which highlights the importance of partnering with the private sector. This is especially true when thinking about further introduction of technology and digital teaching and learning, as mentioned by Howard, Canute, and Michela. Finally, many secondary students don't have access to higher education because they don't meet the minimum standards for entry, and there were talks about the building blocks of education and shifts in the curriculum. This relates also to the need for better quality secondary education and better links between secondary and tertiary curriculum. And better quality education leads us back to the need for high quality teachers, which we ended on in our discussion. The IDB recently financed the development of internal quality assurance standards for all teacher training institutions in Jamaica. and STEM training for their instructors in math and science using UNESCO's microscience kits, and problem-based learning as an important step towards improving teacher training programs. We also collaborated with UWI's Caribbean Center for Educational Planning to organize a meeting with Caribbean universities and colleges to learn how the pandemic is impacting them. And the IDB is financing a study this year on aspects of higher education, such as staff qualifications and financing mechanisms, which will include the Caribbean. In all the areas we've discussed, reliable real-time data and information is essential. Didicus and Howard talked about the use of data and generation of knowledge. Over the last years, the IDB has carried out studies of education management information systems in 18 countries and cities across Latin America and the Caribbean, including Jamaica and Suriname, with a study to come this year in the Bahamas. One important lesson we've learned from these studies is that ministries collect educational data from schools and students, but they don't consider schools as users of the data. When schools analyze the data, they can think more deeply about how to reduce inequalities among their students, how to appreciate the diversity of their education community, and how to include all the voices in the design and implementation of more flexible education programs, as Michaela mentioned, for a just right approach to creating global citizens. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for pulling together key points, even as you use the opportunity to highlight some of the valuable work that the IDB has been doing in the region. So we want to thank you. Thank you for joining us. And at this time, colleagues, we really want to say a hearty thank you from the UNESCO Cluster Office for the Caribbean to all our presenters, our panelists, our participants, our moderators who took time out of their very busy schedule, I'm sure, to join with us today. We want to thank you for being a part of this Futures of Education initiative. And we know this is an ambitious program as we seek to reimagine the role of education in an increasingly complex, diverse, and interconnected global community.